Welcome to Haunting Faith, presented by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. This event is part of our Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences in the College of Liberal Arts, and I will be your host for today's presentation and the entire Dark Reflections series. Thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we get into the spooky spirit of the season. Today's presenter is Dr. Ruth DeFoster. Dr. DeFoster is an associate professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at the University of Minnesota. Her research on terrorism, mass shootings, gun violence, and popular culture has been published in a variety of journals, including Health Communication, Contemporary Drug Problems, Journal of Communication Inquiry, Communication, Culture, and Critique, as well as SAGE Research Methods Cases. Dr. DeFoster is the author of the 2017 book, Terrorizing the Masses, Identity, Mass Shootings, and the Media Construction of Terror, and the forthcoming book, The Fear Not, How Science, History, and Culture Shape Our Fears and How to Get Unstuck. And most recently, she is co-author of the new book, Catholic Horror on Television, Haunting Faith. Dr. DeFoster's professional background is in journalism, and she has over a decade of experience as a writer, editor, and journalist. Today, Dr. DeFoster will discuss her research on spooky television and Catholic horror in the streaming era, unpacking what these stories reflect about our hopes, our culture, and our deepest fears. Dr. DeFoster, thank you for joining us. I invite you to begin today's presentation.
Can everyone see that? Splendid. Okay. So a little bit about me. I see some familiar faces. It's lovely to see everyone here. So as Megan mentioned, my professional background is in journalism. I was a print feature reporter for many years, and when I went to graduate school, I intended to go back into the practice of journalism. But along the way, I really just fell in love with teaching and research, and I began to become really curious about the way that the media helped to shape not just how we see ourselves, but also how we see others, how we perceive fear and danger. And a lot of this has to do with my upbringing. I grew up in New York. I was 15 when 9/11 happened, and we moved to Minnesota shortly thereafter. And one of my core memories is standing there at the World Trade Center in 10 days after 9/11 with my fingers through this chain link fence, like surrounded by thousands of other New Yorkers who were mourning, who were grieving, and thinking about, what does this mean? The stories that we tell about risk and about danger and who is a threat to us and why. And so when I ended up going to graduate school, it was a really interesting time. I went to grad school in 2008, and the year before there had been this devastating mass shooting at Virginia Tech. And at the time, it was, to that date, the most deadly mass shooting in American history. And I was very, very interested in the way that the media were covering this shooting, and specifically the way that they were giving unlimited airtime to the shooter, Cho Seung-Hui. And one of my colleagues at the time was a Finnish Fulbright scholar named Teemu Pelikangas. He's great, still friends with him. And he was from Kauhajoki, or he was from rather Helsinki, Finland. And he told me that there had just been a very similar mass shooting in Finland, in Kauhajoki. And he started bringing in these physical copies, back then it was still a physical newspaper, of the Helsinki Sanomat, which is the New York Times of Finland. And we started comparing the coverage of this Finnish tragedy to coverage of this American tragedy. And what we discovered was something really interesting. We discovered that the Finns never named the shooter at all. The Finns never gave him any airtime at all. It was all about national unity and moving forward and how the rest of the world saw Finland as a result. Whereas this American story was covered in very sensational terms. And so that was the very first paper that I ever wrote about media coverage of fear and terrorism and things that were scary and gun violence. And so I ended up really diving into that in my research, and I ended up studying media coverage of terrorism. I still do work in this vein. I have a book chapter and a conference paper coming out this year regarding my work on communicating terror, but this book was something kind of new for me. This book was about 2 years in the making, and it began at the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, AEJMC, which is a big conference in my field for other journalism educators and researchers. This was in 2022. It was in Detroit, and I am a very longtime member of the Cultural and Critical Studies Division at AEJMC, which I'll talk about in just a second. And several of my colleagues and I had gone to this wonderful session, and we were talking afterward. We were having dinner, and in the process of having dinner, I and my colleagues that I've been working with for 15 years, we realized that we were all watching shows about Catholic horror, all of us at the same time. We had this wonderful hours-long conversation about the way that these shows reflected or made accessible real scandals that were plaguing the Catholic Church, how these stories functioned as a way to make sense of a complicated world. And that's how this book was born. So we created a proposal. We pitched it to Lexington Books, which is a subsidiary of Rowman and Littlefield. It came out this summer. And I'm going to primarily talk about the chapter that I wrote. And so, spoilers ahead for the Netflix series Midnight Mass. But first, for those who don't know the field, just a little bit of background about cultural studies and what it is. This is the book. This is what it looks like. It just came out. And I want to mention this at the outset that if you are a University of Minnesota student or alumnus or alumna, you can read this book for free because I have asked the University of Minnesota Library to get access to a digital copy that has unlimited access and downloads. So anyone who is associated with the university can read it for free if you have access to the library. So I want to talk a little bit about cultural studies and what it is. Cultural studies is an approach to media. It's a set of approaches to the study of culture and society. And it's really a school of thought that is very new. It began in Birmingham in the UK as recently as the 1960s at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. The original group of researchers who founded this approach focused their work on the interplay of representations and ideologies of class, gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality in what they called cultural texts. And what really set them apart was that they were the first to take seriously popular culture. Before this period, there was this sense, certainly in academia and higher ed, that there's a hierarchy of culture, right? And that some cultural forms are more worthy of academic study than others, like the great American novel, opera, Shakespeare, right? Fine art, that belongs in the realm of academic study. But pop culture, no. And until the 1960s, if we were having this conversation at any university, there would be no class called Media and Pop Culture, which is a class that I teach, because it simply was not taken very seriously. And so these folks came along, Stuart Hall, Celia Lurie, Raymond Williams, all of these folks came along and they said, hey, actually, what people are consuming on a daily basis is really important. And newspapers are really important. And the punk scene is really important. And so what Stuart Hall was really interested in was how young people in the UK at the time were actually pushing back against the mainstream culture and creating their own culture in ways that were not being taken seriously by adults. They were not being taken seriously by the mainstream culture. But there was this really strong component of like anti-Thatcherism that was happening there and anti-Reaganism. And it was a really interesting moment that should be analyzed. Another thing that cultural studies folks analyze is romance novels, right? Just to give you an example of like the type of text that most folks would not take seriously, but we do take seriously. There's a great piece from 1991, a great book called Reading the Romance by Janice Radway. And this is a cultural studies text that's classic because Janice Radway looked at the realm of book publishing and said, no one is talking about this $1 billion-a-year industry of romance novels. It's huge. Women in droves are reading these books. What are they doing with these books? And so she wrote this beautiful piece about how that actually women who are reading these books, they're not dumb. They're second wave feminists who are understanding that this is a form of escapism for them and it's a way of coping with their situation. And so what I am trying to say here is that cultural studies folks really take everything seriously. They take Twitter seriously. They take TikTok seriously, right? They take romance novels seriously. They take television seriously. And so what cultural studies does is it totally rejects this high-low dichotomy of culture. It says a text can be anything that you can unpack. And cultural studies also says that true impartiality is impossible. We all come to the table with our backgrounds, with our identities, with our biases. And so in cultural studies, what we do as scholars is we acknowledge our positionality. And so in this book, I think it is particularly relevant to know that 3/4 of us who wrote this book are ex-Catholics, right? And that is actually relevant, right? For the reader to understand our context, our history, our experiences, and who we are going into writing this book. And so we have actually a section on positionality that talks about our personal experiences with organized religion. And that's just really important to sort of understanding the text. So to put it really simply, we consider these texts, television shows in this case, to be these really important spaces where audiences not only embed themselves in this fictional, fantastical world, but they also tell us who we are as a culture. They tell us what we value. They teach us what to fear. They interpolate us. They call out to us. They invite us to see ourselves in the way that the text is hailing us. They invite us to adopt their system of reason and logic. And they reflect back, often in monstrous, ludicrous ways, many of our real world darkest fears. So I'm going to just briefly discuss the other chapters here, and then I'll talk about the chapter that I wrote. So in chapter 1, The Monstrous Feminine Revolt in the Exorcist television series, Laura Bulf Bellevue analyzes The Exorcist, and this is not the film that came out in the 1970s, but instead the television series that came out from 2016 to 2017. And this originated on the Fox Television Broadcast Network, but it is now available both seasons on Hulu. Each season focuses on a pair of Catholic priests, Fathers Marcus Keene and Thomas Ortega. The former is a seasoned exorcist. The latter has visions of Keene conducting an exorcism and finds him when he needs help with one of his parishioners. Each season features different exorcisms, but there's this larger story arc about the Catholic Church that emerges throughout the series. Those in high positions want to stop the exorcisms to allow demons entrance into the church, into the world. And as Keene and Ortega thwart the church and continue their work, they find support from Father Bennett, who is an emissary from the Vatican tasked with reining them in. And in their work repelling demons and confronting this growing evil within the church, these three priests are assisted by Catholic laywomen who are read in this analysis as embodying what Barbara Creed called the monstrous feminine. So there's these interactions between these priests and the Catholic women that are really telling, and they disrupt Catholic patriarchal knowledge and practices. These three priests, Keene, Ortega, and Bennett, are challenged, bettered, and changed by the monstrous feminine characters in this series. Chapter 3 focuses on the CBS series Evil, which features a three-person team of assessors who work for the Catholic Church in New York City to determine if supernatural phenomenon are natural or divine in origin. And if that sounds familiar, yes, that is indeed the plot of the X-Files. Erica Engstrom talks about how the Catholic Church figures really prominently in this series as both an organization and as a faith identity, which features elements of both horror and humor. This show is funnier than the other shows that we watched. So Evil stands apart from other networks and even from other streaming offerings through its really overt criticisms and allusions to scandals within the Catholic Church and the depiction of the Catholic Church as being completely obsessed with liability. And in the series, evil becomes tangible through the actions of malevolent forces that seek the end of the church and the portrayal of demons that harass the show's protagonists. And this series really depicts this epic struggle between the Catholic Church and unrelenting evil. Finally, in chapter 4, The Weird, the Eerie, and Folk Horror in 30 Coins, Ralph Beliveau explored the properties of folk horror, atmospherics, effects, and narrative patterns that define the notion of what horror scholars call the weird, which is a subgenre that emphasizes the strange, the uncanny, and the often incomprehensible aspects of horror. So he studied this slightly different notion of what he calls the eerie. And this is a Spanish language series that was produced for HBO Europe. It is actually called Treinta Monedas. And Ralph, actually, what he watched was the English subtitled version of that Spanish series. And something that would be really interesting to study moving forward, but that I haven't studied yet, would be to look at how some of these, particularly these Netflix offerings, and these streaming offerings, they often change the content of the series when it is dubbed or subtitled for an English-speaking audience. And that definitely happened in this show, which is really interesting. Another show that it happened in was Squid Games. So when that show came out, a lot of my South Korean students were coming to me saying, hey, actually, if you listen to the original dialogue in Korean, it's not what they're dubbing it into English. It's actually a substantially different show. So that would be a really interesting avenue for future research to compare and contrast how the original show compares to the dubbed version. But what he was looking at was the dubbed version. And the first season ran from November 2020 through January 2021. There is now a second season, I believe. And so what this show does is it takes viewers through these interwoven stories that are set in this small Spanish town, and it focuses on this priest, Father Vergara, who possesses one of the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas for betraying Christ. There's this subversive sect within the church that is collecting all 30 pieces in order to overthrow the existing Catholic hierarchy. And Father Vergara works with the town veterinarian and the mayor to untangle a mystery that has led to an outbreak of supernatural happenings. So 30 Coins contends with the Catholic Church by drawing on an intersection between notions of folk horror and the very, very weird. And of course, I focused on Midnight Mass, which I will talk about in a second. But first, just a little bit of background here. So horror and storytelling has really deep roots. It traces all the way back to ancient narratives about battles between humans and monsters and evolved through works like Dante's Inferno and Gothic novels. Think all the way back to the Iliad or the Aeneid, and how there are elements of horror even in those stories, right? And these great monsters that we have to contend with. And later on, when we move into like the Gothic era, a lot of those stories did use Catholic imagery with elements like ruined abbeys, corrupt priests, that creates this sense of dread in readers. And in the early US, fictional accounts portrayed Catholicism as a threatening force, reflecting societal fears of Catholicism as an alien religion. Early Gothic literature mirrored the political and spiritual tensions between Catholics and Protestants, especially during conflicts like the Seven Years' War. As the horror genre transitioned from literature to film, it maintained a really strong connection to Catholic themes. Notable films like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby introduced what is known as divine horror, combining everyday settings with supernatural elements to explore themes of good versus evil. And while horror thrived in early cinema, its transition to television was more challenging. And that was simply just because of the technological challenges of the time. Think about how very simple television was when it first came out in the 1950s. But over time, horror did find a place in various TV genres. It blended with comedy, with drama, and more. Think about how in the late 20th century, you start to see shows like Supernatural or Buffy the Vampire Slayer that successfully incorporate those religious horror themes. And of course, the rise of internet streaming has transformed television, particularly in the horror genre. With advances in special effects and the ability to watch content on demand, viewers have access to a wider variety of horror films and shows than ever before. Platforms like Netflix or HBO offer specific horror categories. They cater to niche audiences, while there are entire services like Shudder that focus exclusively on horror, that provide films, series, and documentaries that often explore graphic content. So this new landscape allows for much more complex storytelling that can tackle much more controversial topics like violence, race, and sexuality. I'm going to talk about Midnight Mass in just a moment. Midnight Mass is a show that would never air on network television. It is too violent. It is just far too explicit and visceral in its violence, but that violence is a really important part of the story. TV shows like The Walking Dead and Lovecraft Country push boundaries, while other series like Supernatural depict Catholicism as a key force against evil, often portraying priests in a positive light. So, in horror films and shows, Catholicism is really depicted in contrasting ways, as a protective force against evil or as a source of evil itself. For instance, films like Stigmata portray the church as oppressive, while others like The Exorcist show it as a hero in the battle against demonic forces. And the portrayal of Catholicism often falls into this binary view of good versus evil, although more recent narratives have challenged this simplicity by exploring the complexities of faith and morality within the church. So in Midnight Mass, these themes of Catholic horror and vampirism collide. In this book, I argue that the series serves as an exemplar of horror verite through the deployment of many of the conventions of the horror genre. You have vampirism, you have the occult, animal sacrifice, demonic possession, to unmask very real crises that are facing an embattled Catholic Church in the 21st century. Over the course of 7 episodes, all of which are named for books of the Bible, Genesis, Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations, Gospel, Acts of the Apostles, and Revelation, the series unfurls an insidious tale of corruption, death, rebirth, and the perils of fanaticism and fundamentalism. Midnight Mass deploys many of the conventions of the horror genre. You have an isolated town torn apart by supernatural violence, the persuasive appeal of a charming and sympathetic vampire, and the looming threat of demonic specters who hover in the peripheries and the shadows. So let's get to the show. Midnight Mass is a Netflix supernatural horror limited series with 7 episodes, created and written by Mike Flanagan, who is a filmmaker who's well known for his prolific work in the horror genre. This show premiered in 2021, and I watched the entire series through about 5 times during the summer of 2023, which soon grew annoying for my family. My method in analyzing this text was critical discourse analysis, which focuses primarily on the ideological work of language, particularly with reference to power relations and the ways that texts help to both produce and reflect our common culture. So again, I analyzed this text through the lens of what Alison Landsberg called horror verite, which is building on an older term that you might have already heard, which is called cinema verite. So Landsberg coined this term in 2018, horror verite, to describe a style of horror that contains at its core a truthful message about real endemic horrors that afflict American society. And I'm going to quote from that piece. Quote, in other words, rather than using these techniques to explore the psychology of a serial killer, or to enforce the dominant ideology, or to symbolize society's fears in the form of a monster, the mechanics of horror are here engaged in a project of representing the present. The typical horror film usually offers some kind of terrifying psychological fantasy, but in horror verite, the terrifying nightmare is an everyday reality. And a good example of this, a recent example of the use of horror verite would be the 2017 Jordan Peele film Get Out, right? So in this film, Peele, yes, he's using the sensational trappings of the horror genre, but he's using it to expose a true reality, an insidious reality in American society, the problem of endemic racism. And in this chapter, I argue that the filmmakers are using this text in a very similar way. So I'm going to briefly describe now each of the books of the show. In Genesis, which is named for the first book of the Bible that contains the biblical creation story, we meet Riley, who is a troubled young man who returns home to live with his parents on present-day Crockett Island, a gloomy, isolated village off the coast of Washington, whose already sparse population has been further decimated by an oil spill that took place years earlier. The fictional Crockett Island is based loosely on Governor's Island, which is a tiny 172-acre island community in New York, where Flanagan, the filmmaker, once served as an altar boy at a now abandoned Catholic church called Our Lady Star of the Sea. Crockett Island's prospects are dark, both literally and figuratively, as the community is ensconced in a near ubiquitous atmospheric gloom. And so are the prospects for young Riley, who you see here on the left, who is returning home in disgrace after serving a prison term for drunk driving that killed a young woman 4 years prior. Creepily, the town is packed with stray cats when Riley arrives home, which is a fact that becomes even more creepy when the bodies of the cats turn up dead en masse the following day, having washed up to the shores of the islands with broken necks. And when I looked into the symbolism of dead cats, I found something really interesting. There's an interesting parallel in Catholic history. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued the Vox in Rama, which is a papal decree that is famous for condemning devil worship and heresy. And one of the things it's most famous for is helping to create, regularize, and strengthen the now infamous Papal Inquisition. But it also included a really unusual warning. It said that Satan could take the form of a cat. And so this warning was based on the alleged confessions of tortured Spanish heretics, these victims of the Spanish Inquisition, again, who claimed that they had served the devil in cat form. And so this edict from the Pope led to the wholesale slaughter of cats during the following 2 years, and the preferred methods were drowning and breaking their necks. So in Genesis, the massacre of the island's cats presages both the island's coming destruction and the complicated history that the Catholic Church has with feline symbolism. And by the end of this episode, Riley connects with Erin, his childhood sweetheart, who's also come to the island running from something, in her case, an abusive marriage. And he's happy to reconnect with Erin, but he realizes that she is pregnant. Book 2, Psalms. In both Genesis and Psalms, these are both named for books of the Bible that feature songs of praise. One of the first mysteries of the show is answered. This question of what happened to the elderly Father Pruitt, this elderly priest who has disappeared, and he has been replaced by a much younger priest who's turned up to fill in for Pruitt during his unexplained absence. And while Pruitt had been in rapid cognitive and physical decline, Father Paul is brimming with this very intense, infectious energy. And he prompts Riley, who's a recovering alcoholic, to attend AA meetings. He delivers rousing religious sermons that buoy the flagging spirits of the small flock. But Riley is not interested in returning to church. Since his prison stint, he has lost his faith. He's disillusioned with Catholicism. But his father loses his patience and demands that he attend church as a condition of his parole. Another condition of his spiritual parole involves being haunted, both literally and figuratively, by the ghost of the girl he killed. The gregarious Father Pruitt, however, is able to draw Riley into these deep conversations about faith, religion, good and evil, many of which mirror Flanagan's own process of deconstruction and the loss of his Catholic faith. And by the end of the second episode, we realize that something very weird is going on in Crockett Island. One day, during a rousing sermon, Father Paul orders Lisa, who you see here, played by Anara Simone, a disabled teenage girl who is in a wheelchair. After being struck in a DUI accident by the town drunk, Joe, he orders her to get up and walk. And to the astonishment of the town, she gets up and she walks. She has been miraculously cured. By the third book, more miracles soon begin to happen. No one is more delighted than the fanatical character of Bev, who is a church parishioner who serves as Father Paul's right-hand woman and de facto leader of the congregation in his absence. Amid the religious fervor which subsumes the entire island, Bev manages to mandate Bible study in the island's school. This alienates the town's sheriff, who is Muslim and has a young son, Ali, who attends the school. Father Paul, who's been struggling with a mysterious illness, begins coughing up blood, and by the midpoint of the series, we learned what really happened to his missing predecessor, Father Pruitt. There's a flashback in which the elderly Father Pruitt descends into a cave, whereupon a winged beast descends and bites his neck. As the beast stands up, looking down at the priest, the creature slits its wrists and forces the priest to drink its blood. Father Paul is Father Pruitt. It soon becomes clear that he is also a vampire. By drinking the blood of this mysterious creature, he has become young again, and he is slowly transforming into a creature identical to the beast whose blood he drank. And the blood, it turns out, is the source of the town's miracles. Father Paul has been mixing the blood into the communion wine. There's this very dark and liminal quality to the scenes that feature the sacrament of communion, even before the viewer learns that the communion wine has been laced with real vampire's blood. And the reverence with which these scenes are shot really echoes some previous scholarly observations that Catholic horror often strongly echoes preconciliar teachings about the existence of a devil and demons, and harkens back to an almost Gothic medieval image of the Catholic Church as being engaged in this great ongoing spiritual battle against the forces of evil. But unlike these mainstream 20th century films like The Exorcist or The Omen, in Midnight Mass, the Catholic Church is not in the business here of fending off evil. The evil has taken root at the church itself, and it becomes a cancer. In Book 4, Lamentations, while many of the miraculous events seem like gifts from God, for example, Mildred, an elderly dementia patient, seems to grow younger and more lucid by the day. Lisa regains feeling in her legs despite her spinal injury. The character of Erin finds herself in the midst of a decidedly less welcome miraculous event. Her unborn baby has disappeared without a trace from her womb, with no sign that she was ever pregnant. After taking a blood sample from Erin, Sarah, the town doctor, is mystified to see a vial of Erin's blood fizzling and catching fire in the sun. Erin and Riley soon grow close again, and Riley tells Erin about a recurring dream in which he's sitting in an empty boat in the middle of a wide open bay, waiting for a sunrise he can never reach. They debate the existence and nature of heaven. Erin's definition, "you are loved and you aren't alone," is particularly poignant and at odds with Catholic orthodoxy. Erin and Riley's understanding of faith or God has unspooled from the Catholic rites and duties of their youth and has evolved to focus primarily on shared human connection, the sense of belongingness to something larger than oneself. And just past the midway point of the series, the townsfolk tip from religious fervor firmly into fanaticism. Father Paul is struggling with his new urges to drink blood and struggling to understand why the angel, as he believes him to be, chose him on whom to bestow its miracles. He is unable to control his violent urges and his desire for blood, and he kills the town drunk Joe in a moment of weakness one evening and immediately begins to drink his blood. Bev, who finds Father Paul in a delirious state over Joe's dead body, makes the fateful decision to hide the crime, ordering the scene to be cleaned up. And when Riley goes to speak to Father Paul at the town's recreation center that night, he instead finds Father Paul drinking from a vessel filled with his sacrament, the blood of the creature who was standing nearby. The creature descends on Riley and mortally wounds him. This is the creature here. But like Father Paul, we learn later in episode 5 that Riley is resurrected by the blood of the creature. He becomes like Father Paul. He becomes a vampire. He rapidly recovers under the care of Father Paul, who reveals his true identity to him and tells him he believes the angel's blood is a gift from God. Indeed, for weeks, he was mixing it into the communion wine to heal the residents of Crockett Island. And Riley, with eyes that now glow in the dark, returns to the home where his family sleeps, listening to the cacophonous sounds of their heartbeats with his newfound heightened vampiric senses. In Book 5, Gospel, at the very beginning of the 5th episode, many of the townspeople, Father Paul included, have become averse to sunlight because they are vampires, and Mass has moved permanently to midnight. Riley appears on Erin's doorstep after being missing for days and asks her to go offshore in a boat with him, a little rowboat like the one in his dream. Rowing far away from the island, Riley reveals what happened to him at the recreation center. He tells Erin the truth, that Father Paul is a vampire, that he's been spiking the communion wine with blood, and that he, too, was killed and resurrected by the vampire after drinking its blood. He tells Erin he brought her on the boat to isolate himself from the innocent people on the island, and he declares his love for her. And as the sun rises, he combusts and he turns to ashes in the sunlight. And the title of this episode, Gospel, echoes the biblical story of Jesus, whose message and sacrifice are reflected in Riley's sacrifice. And I'm going to just show you that scene. It's about 3 minutes long. It is a little violent at the end, so if you need to turn it off, take care of yourself.
I brought you out here so I'd have nowhere to go. I'm not as strong as you. I never was. What do I want? I want you to take this boat and row to the mainland and leave this place and never look back. But I knew you wouldn't do that. I knew you wouldn't believe any of this unless you saw. I want you to run. But I believe you're gonna row back there and do everything you can to try and save them. I'm just so sorry you have to see this. I love you, Aaron Green. I love you my whole life, one way or another.
I love you too.
I did my best. I did my best.
And this is, in fact, pretty typical of how the series ends. So by the penultimate episode, the town is soon split along clear-cut ideological lines. So you have those who are led by Bev, who wholeheartedly accept and welcome the angel's miracle, who seek to become angels themselves, and those who are understandably terrified at the evil taking root at the heart of the church, who refuse to drink the blood and transform into vampires. And in the end, the townsfolk who support the vampires vastly outnumber the few holdouts, which include Aaron, Sheriff Hassan, Riley's younger brother Warren, Lisa, Dr. Sarah, and the townsfolk Annie and Ed. Father Paul, who still seems to earnestly believe that the vampires' powers are angelic and heaven sent, explains at the Easter Vigil that although the blood of the angel is already in their veins, they must give up their earthly bodies so that new divine ones can take their places. And if that sounds familiar, it is very in keeping with New Testament teachings. In a dramatic scene, a man named Sturge offers himself as a willing sacrifice, dying and being reborn before the entire church. The townsfolk begin to drink the proffered blood, including young Ali, Hassan's son. Violent scuffles between the few holdouts and the vampires ensue, with multiple casualties. But in the end, the dead vampires are reborn and they awaken hungry, wreaking havoc on the island, spilling out into the town to feast upon the blood of those who did not drink. And by the end, a band of new vampires, led by Bev, goes from home to home, dragging townsfolk out to feast on them. A mournful Father Paul reveals that the reason he brought the creature back into the town to begin with was to save the life of his youthful sweetheart, Mildred, the mother of Sarah, the town's doctor, who prior to the arrival of the vampire had been elderly and struggling with dementia. And as chaos and destruction rain down around him, Father Paul finally realizes that he has made a mistake. This creature is not an angel, and this isn't what he wanted. But his realization comes too late, and the bloodthirsty Bev overrides him. She is in the position of power now. By the end of Revelation, which is named for the last book of the Bible that depicts the end of the world, Most of the key characters in the series do not survive the finale. Aaron is killed, but not before clipping the wings of the vampire, ensuring that it cannot fly away to escape the coming sunlight. As Aaron dies, she remembers the conversation that she had with Riley about what might come after death. And this is a perspective shift that strongly echoes Buddhist rather than Catholic theology. Erin described herself as a drop of water returning to the ocean, not a singular person anymore, but a communal energy, a part of everything. She dies with a smile on her face. The others, including Sheriff Hassan, Riley's father Ed, Riley's mother Annie, and Sarah, sacrifice their lives to burn the island and the boats to the ground to ensure that the youngest two survive. Lisa and Warren are able to escape the island in a rowboat. Unable to escape, all the townspeople inflicted by the vampire burn to ashes in the sunrise, and from a distance, the two young teenagers watch the carnage unfold. And as they get farther and farther away, with ash falling around them, Lisa realizes that she can no longer feel her legs again. So, a few core themes of Midnight Mass. First, the series uses vampiric horror as an allegory for rot or corruption at the heart of the Catholic Church, transforming and perverting the sacred art of communion into a dangerously addictive poison. And vampirism might seem like an unusual pairing for a story about organized religion, but in fact, blood and the ritual consumption of blood has always been a really important part of the Christian tradition. One of the most important Catholic sacraments is the ritual of communion, in which the faithful consume bread and wine that symbolizes the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And this practice originates in the New Testament, which describes the Last Supper before Jesus' crucifixion and prescribes specific rules for Christians to symbolically eat and drink of the body and blood of Christ in memory of this supper and in memory of Christ's sacrifice every time they gather in his name. Now, for Catholics, this sacrament represents spiritual nourishment, unity with Christ, and these communal bonds among believers in the church. And for a majority of Christian Protestants and some Catholics, the body and blood of Christ have always been considered symbolic, but many devout Catholics believe in transubstantiation, which refers to the belief that the bread and wine consumed by parishioners miraculously and literally transforms into the physical body and blood of Christ once it is consumed. And so in that sense, the vampiric elements in Midnight Mass really feel like a natural evolution of this existing practice of a belief that many Catholics share regarding this very literal consumption of blood and flesh as a divine sacrament. And in Midnight Mass, as is common in other historical horror texts that feature vampirism, giving into the temptations offered by a vampire, like the promise of youth, health, and seemingly eternal life, signifies giving in to one's grimmest or darkest inclinations. And on Crockett Island, we see that naked desire for power and dominance that perverts the faith of the congregation into a blind fanaticism, all lofty desires forgotten in this descent into visceral, carnal desire. There's another parallel to be made between the vampiric cannibalistic theme of blood drinking throughout the series, the character Riley's alcoholism. Riley's journey toward recognizing himself as an alcoholic is lengthy. It is fraught with self-hatred and self-pity. And interestingly, in many conversations that he has with Father Paul, Riley and Paul agree that alcohol itself is morally neutral. And Father Paul goes on to say that the same is true of grief and suffering. And I'm going to quote here. He says, quote, "Alcohol isn't good or bad, not itself, but it's people. Suffering can be a gift. It all just depends on us, what we do with it, how we react to it. So alcohol isn't good or bad. And the same with grief, guilt, suffering. It just depends on what we do with it." Second, Midnight Mass functions as a negative inversion of the biblical Easter story, asking viewers to upend pre-existing assumptions about the role of the institutional church, both in reality and in Catholic horror as a genre. A lot of the elements of this series invert Catholic rituals. So, for example, the sacrament of communion, the ritual drinking of blood, of course, is perverted by the addition of a poison that masquerades as a blessing. Rather than salvation being delivered to the faithful by a holy woman, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Midnight Mass, the rot at the heart of the church is fueled and abetted by the zealous Bev, another true believer who, despite her coward's heart, enjoys a moment of righteous sanctification and leadership to rival almost that of Joan of Arc or the biblical Deborah. And there's an additional inversion here to the traditional biblical story of Mary and the miraculous conception of Jesus, the loss of the character Aaron's baby, who miraculously, mysteriously disappears from its mother's womb. And then after the penultimate scene in the church, when most of the town are transformed into vampires, Bev and her army of vampires go out forth on the island to seek out those who did not drink the vampire's blood. And in doing so, they perform a sort of perverse form of spreading the gospel. They're dragging out individual non-vampires to be killed, their blood consumed to fuel the growing mob. And additionally, I mentioned this before, but Father Paul delivers this very earnest appeal at the Easter Vigil in which he instructs members of the church that they must give up their earthly bodies so new divine ones can take their places. And this invocation is very much in keeping with Catholic theology about the afterlife, which provides a very interesting juxtaposition to Aaron and Riley's observations and hopes about death being a gentle return to the communal whole. This vision of heaven is a deeply individual one. It promises the faithful complete healing, youth, eternal life, and perhaps most importantly, enormous power. There are also many parallels in the series to New Testament parables, most notably the character of Riley, who functions as a prototypical prodigal son. In the Bible, the prodigal son is a parable that describes the return of a disgraced son to his family. And the parable in the Bible is a story about grace and forgiveness. A younger son demands his inheritance early from his landowning father. He squanders it, much as Riley squandered his youth and opportunities by drowning his sorrows in alcohol. In the parable, the young man returns home to great love and fanfare from his family despite his betrayal. And Riley's acceptance into his own family is more gradual, but like the prodigal son, he soon recognizes his own folly and grows into a much more mature and empathetic person. This personal growth and evolution mirrors show creator Flanagan's own. He writes that the show was, quote, conceived by a young man in the grips of barely functional alcoholism, a complicated anger at organized religion, and a growing interest in forgiveness and humanism, unquote. But that his growth into a sober husband and father has shifted his perspective toward becoming more nuanced and broad-minded. And this is a shift that we see in Riley's character as well. And finally, the series invites the viewer to beware the perils of fundamentalist thinking in any belief system, unpacking and critically examining the ideologies that are embedded in what Althusser called ideological state apparatuses, of which the media are one, and certainly organized religion are another, and inviting the viewer to consider the ways these institutions can often descend into fanaticism. And I just want to leave with this quote from Mike Flanagan, I just think is really interesting. This is what I would consider to be a meta text. So when I was doing my analysis, I did also consider some of the interviews and the writing that the show creator Flanagan created about the show to help me contextualize and understand what he intended the show to mean. And this is from a piece that he wrote in 2021. He says he was struck by how fundamentalist thinking could permeate and corrupt any belief system. It could appear and spread in the scientific community, nationalism, politics, the media, how easy faith could be weaponized against the faithful, how incentivized we could be made to believe something in the absence of evidence, or even more disturbing, in the presence of contradictory facts. I was horrified at how this cognitive dissonance was in some circles presented as a virtue. And I think that is a very important lesson for us in 2024 as we approach the election. So that's it. And I will now take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. DeFoster. Your talk has definitely inspired me to rewatch Midnight Mass again. We are now going to move to the Q&A portion of the event. I see a few questions have already come in, so just a reminder to go ahead and keep submitting questions or comments or reactions through the Q&A button. Dr. DeFoster is going to get through as many questions as we have time for.
Sure. I see the first question says, do you think it's possible to critique the institutional church while treating faith respectfully? And my answer to that is yes, because I think that's what we've done in this book. If you read the book, you'll see that there is a section that's called positionality. And that section talks about our lived experiences with organized religion. And yes, so my family originally was Catholic. My mother ended up converting to Protestantism. And so I was raised primarily in the Protestant church. But there was a lot of overlap between Catholicism because the sect that I was raised in is called the Presbyterian Church of America, which is the much more conservative fundamentalist vision of Presbyterian than the PCUSA, which is much more progressive. And so we have an entire section in there where we talk about our histories with religion. But we did think it's really important to approach this really respectfully because we recognize and understand that faith is an important identity for millions of Americans that is absolutely core to who we are and how we consider ourselves ourselves. And I've actually studied this in a lot of my other work, particularly looking at media coverage of terrorism and mass shootings. I've looked at how Islam has been covered. And I am not Muslim. I have no personal history with Islam, but it's very important to be thoughtful and respectful about the centrality of those identities to the people who practice those faiths and those faiths. And that's something that we really strive to do in this class. Somebody says it would be interesting to see an analysis of The Good Omen, where good and evil work together. I agree, and that would be a really fun follow-up for this book. Someone else has asked, why do you think these types of shows resonate with viewers in an increasingly secular post-Christian culture? To that, I would say I don't know that we're post-Christian. I think we are still, the Christian faith is still certainly hegemonic in the United States, but certainly we are seeing an exodus of young people from the faith, which I think is really interesting. And that's kind of why in that last chapter, Revelation, I thought it was really interesting that the only people who sort of got to walk away from this debacle were young people. And that to me felt like a mirror of some of these demographic shifts that we are starting to see. And I do think that these shows resonate particularly with young people who may have concerns or grievances with some of the excesses of organized religion. But I also think it's interesting that all of the shows that we unpacked in this text, they were not binary, they were not clear cut. They were very empathetic and nuanced and sensitive and thoughtful to the fact that faith is a central part of folks' lives. Like it really wasn't this sort of black and white narrative of morality, which I thought was really interesting. Let's see here. Someone has asked, do I anticipate if this chapter of the book will become part of a class I teach in the future? I would love for that to be the case. I teach a class called Media and Pop Culture. It's Journalism 3745, and it's like about 500 students a year. So it's a very popular class. And I do plan to start using some of this in that class, but we do not yet have any classes in the Hubbard School that are devoted specifically to horror. I bet that you could probably find one in film studies. That would be really interesting to take. But so far, we don't have any classes that are specifically devoted to that, but it would be really interesting. Let's see. Hello, Peter. Good to see you. Could you talk about whether or not, to what extent the fear genre serves to allow people to interrogate their faith traditions in ways that other genres may not? The specialness of fear and horror as a genre in critiquing faith. I think it's because, particularly in streaming, we've really been unshackled from the rules of the television era, and we can become so much more visceral in some of these stories that we're telling. And just to go back to Alison Landsberg's example of the Jordan Peele film Get Out, I think the reason why that film is so well suited to unpacking and talking about the problem of endemic racism is because it's so sensational, because it's so over the top, right? Because it forces you to look at something made grotesque. And I think that's really why this genre works for especially large-scale institutional critiques, because we now have 50 years of film tradition depicting the church as this sort of institutional force, either for good or evil. And so I just think it works really well within that genre because it's made so visceral. Someone has asked, there are many religious people who shy away from the horror genre because they associate it with dangerous occult practices. Why do you think that horror is compatible with the Catholic imagination? So I will say this was my upbringing. Like we certainly were not, I actually was raised in a home with no secular media at all. I was not allowed to watch television. No secular media was to be consumed at all. And it was because of this concern about the occult, right? And I even remember, if you go back to the 1990s, there was an Onion article that made the rounds in the evangelical Christian community about Harry Potter encouraging children to explore the occult. And this was before the days when it was really obvious what was satire and what wasn't. And so I remember that kind of going viral in some of the circles that I was in at the time. And I do think that that's one of the things that these series are really exploring, because if you've grown up in the Catholic or the Christian tradition, it's normal to have this sense of angelic and demonic warfare, right? There's actually a Christian author named Frank Peretti who wrote a number of very influential novels in the 1990s. I can't think of what the names of the novels are, but they were all about, they were set in the present time, and they were all about this idea of that there was always angelic and demonic warfare happening around us all the time. And so if you're a young person who grew up in that faith tradition, as I did, it's not much of a leap, right, to see that made real in fiction, to see that veil lifted and the idea that of course this is real and it's happening, and now with the help of this fictional text we can actually see it. So I think that is why it's really compatible with Catholic imagination. Oh, someone said it's This Present Darkness. Thank you. That is correct. It's the This Present Darkness series that I was thinking of, that was very influential for me growing up and thinking about my sort of religious imagination. Someone else has asked, do you think this genre of horror only works for people who were raised within an organized religion? I think it works much better for those who were. When I first presented, I did a shorter presentation of this to just my faculty colleagues last week, and I knew that most of them had been raised in a faith tradition, and so I didn't go into a lot of the details explaining the parables and things. But I think it's one of those things that the more you know, the more you see. And the fact that I sort of happened to share Mike Flanagan's upbringing, I think that helped me to see what he was trying to say in this text more than someone who didn't share that contextual upbringing. But I think it can work for anyone because, again, it's like making sensational the trappings of something that actually reflects like a real world concern. I think, let's see. Is the cautionary tale something we'll still need in a somewhat safer world than it was 100 or even 50 years ago? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, it depends, right? I think that the cautionary tale about fundamentalist thinking is evergreen. I've been certainly like really strongly reminded of that this week as I'm seeing a lot of misinformation proliferate about the election and how that is also being tied very closely to folks' faith identities in ways that are really insidious and interesting. So I think as long as corruption exists, as long as misinformation exists, this will be relevant for sure. Danny has asked, what is my favorite horror movie? Oh boy, that's a really good question. I was in the unusual position of what is it called? It was like a found footage horror movie. The Blair Witch Project. That was it. I was in high school when that came out. And this was before the time when, of course, it was before the time of really social media. MySpace was in its infancy and there was no feed. And so this was, I think, that was probably maybe the last experience that we all had going into it, not understanding that it was a bit, not understanding that it was manufactured and it was not, in fact, found footage. And I found that film to be terrifying. So that was a really good one. Oh, and someone else has asked, why do you think Catholicism is the predominant religion for religious horror films instead of other religions or even different branches of Christianity? I am fascinated by that question as well. And I think it actually harkens back to the influence of those first few films that came out in the 1970s. I think it actually is the influence of the 1970s. So we saw this huge shift in the 70s toward narratives of fear and toward narratives of we were really interested in serial killers, like think about like the Manson family, all the serial killers we were following in the 70s. In the 70s, we became really focused on these stories about institutional horror and specifically Catholic institutional horror. And so you start to see like, you know, The Omen, The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, they all come out during this era. And I think that really set the stage for when we're thinking about horror. When I think about, even if I think about the term exorcism, my first reference is that film, The Exorcist. I don't even think about the Catholic Church anymore. So I go straight to that. I think it's the influence of our really profound media environment that has sort of packed us full of these stories of religious horror. And it is interesting that Catholicism has become the face of that because fundamentalist thinking exists in every tradition, right? It exists in Protestantism, it exists in Judaism, it exists in Islam, it exists in Hinduism, it exists everywhere you can find it. And so it is interesting to think about the fact that at least in the United States, when we think about like institutional corruption, generally it's the Catholic Church is the faith of that. And I don't think that's fair because I think that they take a lot more sort of coverage than they deserve. Oh, interesting. Someone has asked, do you think the angel in Midnight Mass was actually an angel or just a predator vampire? Could it be both somehow or a fallen angel? That's a good question because, again, if you go back to Catholic orthodoxy and theology, the belief is that Lucifer, right, Satan, the main antagonist to God, what actually started as an angel, and that he is a fallen angel who rejected God's teaching, and that thus he has his own sort of angel followers who have followed him. So that's a really interesting interpretation. I always read it more as a traditional vampire who was taking the guise of an angel, but it would be interesting to think of like maybe he was an angel and he fell. Yeah, I like that. I think I answered that first one about the secular post-Christian culture. Do we think horror is particularly suited as a genre to help us unpack issues of our time? Yes, I think it is, because it can make monstrous and make sensational and make like just so visceral these problems that often seem very removed from us, or they seem very theoretical or abstract. And I think the fact that it's so in your face, I mean, thinking about that scene of Riley like burning to death, that can really, it is suited to sort of force us to confront things that we normally wouldn't confront.
Well, we have come to the end of our event. We've made it through all the audience questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question or a comment throughout the event. A special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Ruth DeFoster, for sharing her research and thoughtful analysis on the genre of Catholic horror on television. Our next event in the Dark Reflection series will be Playing with Fear, Monsters, Myths, and Mayhem tomorrow, October 29th. You can find more information about this and other presentations by visiting our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and I'm wishing you a lovely Halloween.